Welcome back everyone to more X4 Foundations here at EVGA Gaming. Today's stress testing video will focus entirely on branch number 2. If you remember, branch number 1 is based entirely around building a fleet. Once we reached 100 ships in our fleet, I made a duplicate save, and now we are in branch number 2, which is focused entirely on building up the number of stations we have and also the complexity of the stations that we have. So for right now, we're going to be focusing entirely on branch number 2 because that's the most fun for me and most closely resembles the way I prefer to play the game. As you can see here on the screen, as we're on the main menu, we have 2.4 million credits right now, and we are just over 16 hours into the game here in branch 2. So let's get started. In today's video, we're going to be talking, of course, about frames per second and what FPS I'm getting in different locations around the map. And we're also going to be jumping into the station progress, as well as talking about any new stations that I've been developing since our last video. And then hopefully by the end of the video, we'll have a little bit of time remaining to do a brief fly-through station tour where I can give you guys an idea on a much bigger scale exactly the state of the stations as they currently are within this particular save. So let's go ahead and start off with the frames per second. I am currently docked at our space fuel factory, which is the biggest and most complex of our stations as they currently are. And as we look around, this is one edge of the space station where one of our docking bays is located, and then we have all of our space fuel modules as well as the water modules and anything else, wheat and so on, that we also need. So this is the most complex out of all to this point. It is also the most busy. It has the most activity of all of our stations, and that's because we have a lot of miners that are associated with this station, as well as some traders and even a few station mules, I believe, are assigned to this particular station, or at least operating with this particular station. This is where I see generally my lowest frames per second, particularly as you can see now, we've got a lot of activity going on here. There's 2 miners that have landed and are now taking off. Looks like we've got another one coming down over there. We will generally, there's one of our station mules that is docking. So a lot of activity, and it's pretty consistent too. For most of the time that you're going to be docked at this station, you're going to be witness to quite a bit of docking and undocking activity, which of course further taxes the system. My frames per second under this type of load, when I'm facing in this direction, giving me the absolute most that it could be going on the screen for this particular spot in the playthrough anyway, I'm generally getting around 45 to 50 frames per second. Now, if I go to some other stations, then that's a little bit different story, and we'll look at that here momentarily. But for this station, with the amount of activity it has, and in trying to give myself the view that is most difficult and most taxing on the frames per second, this is usually about it. Now, sometimes it will drop below the 45 to 50 range. And in fact, every once in a while, if under certain circumstances, I'm not sure if maybe the game is checking for new trades or what might be happening. Maybe one of the economy, maybe the trading stations are trying to update. All of those sorts of things could be happening. But in fact, it's happening right now. We're down to about 33 to 35 frames per second. And generally what will happen is that will stabilize and go right back up to the 45 to 50 range after maybe a couple of minutes. In fact, it's just happened. We're back up into the mid to upper 40s right now. So that happens periodically. The good news for me is it really doesn't disrupt my playthrough. And in fact, if I'm not looking directly at the frames per second counter in the top left-hand corner of the screen, then in all likelihood, I won't notice that the problems are happening. It is very seldom that I have any issues with frames per second, even at this particular point in the gameplay and what we have displayed on the screen. Again, you can see there's more docking that is taking place, and still the frames per second are actually into the mid 50s at this point. So no real issues to speak of there. And of course, the frames per second get better as I move to our less complex stations. Let's actually head over to one of those right now. Now we are currently docked on our energy cell factory, which is a very basic factory and serves only one purpose, and that is to make all of the energy cells that the other factories need. And it is doing quite well with that purpose, but you can see there is nothing visually taxing to the system around here. In fact, we are pegged at the maximum of 60 frames per second here. Every once in a while it'll jump up to 61 or 62 just briefly, but my monitor is capable of the 60 frames per second, and that's what we get in a steady atmosphere on this particular station. Now, there in the distance, you can see the actual energy cell production that is going on, but this is a very slow. This is on the complete opposite end of the scale as far as both complexity as well as the level of activity. You will see very few ships that are docked here. Essentially, the only ships that we see flying in and out of this station on a regular basis are my station mules that are simply coming by to pick up more energy cells for the other stations. So this particular station is essentially the same as flying through open space and traveling from point A to point B for me. Still getting max frames per second, and at the lowest, I generally get down around 55 frames. So just a few frames lower than the maximum, but overall, it's exactly what I would expect it to be. Very low complexity, low activity, and very high frames per second. Now, let's move on to another one of our stations. All right, now we are docked on our Space Weed station, and this station is actually closely coming in on the space fuel station as far as complexity. It's still a fairly new station, but some of the modules here are a lot more intricate. You can see the Space Weed module right over there that has got several domed structures to it. We come over here, the spices structure again is a pretty long structure, takes up quite a bit of area. We got some storage here, and you can just barely make out, but we got some water production going on right there. And as I continue to expand each of these factories, I'm seeing a drop in frames per second, not a huge drop. As I mentioned, we're somewhere in the 45 to 50 range, sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes a little bit lower, depending on the activity and what else the game is trying to calculate at that particular moment. But for the most part, that's the range we're in. It's a little bit lower actually right now. Probably some of that at least is due to the fact that I'm recording. But for the most part, it's a non-issue. And again, it's not something that I really notice during the gameplay very often at all, unless I happen to be staring right at the FPS counter. So with that in mind, now we've seen a few factories. We've seen and talked about the frames per second and the level of activity that I'm getting at these factories. Now let's actually take a look at our fleet and the design of the factories themselves. As we get into the map screen where we're going to discuss both the economy progression as well as the number of ships and stations we have, I will let you know that the map screen, the screen we are currently on, is by far and away the lowest frames per second I generally get in the game. I'm anywhere from, we'll just say 35 frames per second and lower. Currently we're actually operating, it looks like about 25 or so frames per second here, but luckily this doesn't really affect the gameplay all that much, because anytime I'm coming out here, it's generally to select one of the ships or stations. So I don't generally spend a lot of time actually surveying the map itself to find specific things. So for that reason, the low frames per second aren't really a huge deal. It's a bit concerning in the overall scheme of things to have this low of frames per second. In fact, you could see as this ice miner came down the highway system, it was obvious of the low frames per second that I'm currently getting on this screen. But overall, again, I'm generally coming in here for the various menu functions and to select a specific ship and or station. So it's generally not that big of an issue for me, but it is still an issue nonetheless. So let's talk a little bit about the status of our fleet, and along with that, we have to talk about the state of the economy here in the game. Now, you know that one of the very few mods that I'm using on this playthrough is the space station drain. And I'm doing that so that we can keep some sort of an economy going in the game outside, and hopefully in addition to any new ships that are being built, specifically the combat ships and so on that you would find if there's any war going on. Unfortunately, right now, there is very little of any conflict. Every once in a while, there will be a few Xenon that will hop through one of the gates. In fact, one of those is right over here. And every once in a while, they'll jump a few ships through, maybe a small fleet of maybe 4 or 5 at the most, and they'll be pretty quickly disposed of by either Argon or one of the other factions, depending on where we are on the map. So it's really not that big of a deal. We don't have a whole lot of ships being recycled for that purpose of war. But what I have seen is basically a complete collapse of the ability of wharfs and shipyards to take care of themselves. The only ones that operate are the ones that I'm babysitting, and that's simply so that I can get any ships that I need taken care of. Now, as far as our fleet itself, you can see that it has certainly shrunk in terms of the unassigned ships that we have. We currently have a total of 38 unassigned ships. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned early on in the series, and particularly about branch number 2, is that my desire was to get as many of these ships as could possibly be needed as subordinates to our stations as they continue to grow. And that's exactly what's happened, with a couple of exceptions, actually. First and foremost, I had to get rid of all of my silicon miners simply because the demand for silicon dried up completely. We were down to just a couple of hundred as far as demand for silicon in the game world, so I had to move all of those out. Those are now subordinates under the stations. And then even more drastic than that, the gas miners. The demand for all of the gases completely dried up, and I had to actually sell off a good bit of my gas mining fleet for that reason, because currently I really didn't have any factories that could use those as subordinates, so I really didn't have any use for them and didn't want them sitting around in the game world doing absolutely nothing. I figured that, if anything, could only cause issues if it did anything at all. So I wanted to get rid of those and finally just had to sell those off. We're currently sitting at about 97 ships overall, so you can see our total number of ships really hasn't changed a whole lot, but the ones I've gotten rid of, I have replaced in various ways with either station mules or station traders, things like that. So now let's actually take a brief look. You can see we've got a few traders here that are working on hull parts, and what they're actually doing is they are responsible for the fact that my station building is going as well as it is. So what I've got these guys doing is their home sector is right here in Atikva's Choice number 1, and their job, as I'll pull up one of these guys so we can see their behavior tab, they are trading entirely on hull parts. They can go as far as they want to, as far as their abilities will allow them to purchase, but they have to sell here in Atikva's Choice number 1. And the reason for that is that's where I've chosen to build all of my stations. As you can see, if we zoom in here, I've got them all nicely lined up so that I can get back and forth between them to do all the testing I need to do very quickly. So that's what these guys are doing. And the reason why I need these guys is hull parts are the one thing that I have an extremely hard time getting delivered for the new development on each of these stations. So by having my own hull parts traders, they take care of a huge portion of that for me. So moral of the story for me is I have to have certain dedicated traders in order to keep things functioning. Now, I'm sure if I give the AI enough time, they will eventually get me the products that I need to build my stations, but hull parts seems to be a sticky point for them and works very slowly, so having my own traders for that specific purpose is certainly helping. The engine parts trader continues to do the same thing. His job is to try to keep the wharfs as up to date and as full of wares as he possibly can. Again, my focus is entirely on the Argon side of things, because theirs seems to be the wharf that I have to babysit the least. They seem to be the most capable. None of the AI factions are capable at all of keeping their own ships or shipyards and wharfs up and running and full of the materials they need to build ships, but Argon seems to be the best of any of those, so it's simply the least amount of trouble for me. So you can see we've got quite a bit of activity here around my particular stations. Most of those, again, are the miners, and we have a few. You can see a space fuel trader right here that's headed off to the trading station to deliver his wares. But again, most of these are miners. So if we take a look at a few of the individual stations, the energy cell station actually has not changed any whatsoever. So as we take a look here, we've got 3 individual energy cell production modules, a dock, and some basic storage, and that's really it. So very simple there, and I intend to keep it that way because there's really no need for any more than what it currently have. If we go into the Majidust factory, take a look at where it is. Okay, you can see here we have our snail production here, as well as the dust production along the side. And what I'm trying to do for testing purposes here is I try to scale these up. If you take a look at some of the plans that I've gotten saved, I've got the basic energy cell, basic Majidust, space weed, and space fuel. These are all the level 1 blueprints that I've saved. And then as I am able to expand them, as I continue on with the testing, we get into level 2 and level 3 versions of each of these. And we'll see how far we get before the gameplay gets to the point where it becomes a lot more of a grind as far as the frames per second are concerned. All right, so now let's back out and let's take a look at the space fuel factory. And you can see we've got quite a few space fuel production modules that are either already built or in production to be built. We've got some more wheat production going on here. We've got water production down the center line. And I've also added here recently, and once again, the game has backfired on me. One of the issues I seem to have in this game is that from time to time, it just decides that the things that I've queued up to be built really don't belong there, and it will simply remove them. Sometimes it's when I leave the game, come back in the game. Other times, it's simply when I come in, make the changes I want to make with the modules, confirm those, and then a few minutes later, go back in to find that they weren't saved at all. So that is definitely an aggravation for me because on each one of these stations, I had actually added into the queue to be built a few habitats in there because I actually purchased if I can click on the right thing there we go, a medium-sized habitat over in Argon Prime. And now I can see that it's gone, so that's probably going to be the case in each of these stations, but very quickly I want to take a look. That was actually one of the last things I did before exiting out of the game last time. Let's see what we've got. Nope, there we go. We're actually, and what probably saved me here is you can see this one's already done 100%. So the other one, who knows? It might simply be an issue of a certain size queue, and once you get beyond that, then it can't save anymore, or who knows what the issue might be. But it does look like we're going to be okay on this particular factory, the Space Weed factory. But Space Fuel doesn't look good in terms of that. They are gone. I had put them right across the bottom there. A couple of those. So they're gone on that station. We didn't need any on energy cell production. We are more than capable on that particular production. And then the Majidust we've seen, it also is missing those. So I'm very disappointed by the game really messing with me here. And I feel like it trolls me on occasion and not giving me the ability to save things that I would really like to save. But again, going forward, what I'm going to continue to do as long as this gameplay holds out and the frames per second are at least what I would consider to be acceptable to continue on, then I will continue to expand these particular factories until I reach the point that it is no longer feasible to continue. So that's going to do it for today's video. Now, here at the very end, we're going to end with a brief flyby tour that I mentioned at the very beginning, and we'll see you guys next time. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned as we will continue our stress testing of X4 Foundations. Let's go ahead and get our station tour up and running. This will be a fairly quick tour, and hopefully The jittering will be kept to a minimum. If you see the jittering, I promise that is not the game. It is not the frames per second in the game that's causing that. It's the recording software. So between me, the recording software, and the game, we're just not getting along for whatever reason this morning. I've made several adjustments, but we're going to try to get through this, and hopefully the jittering won't be so bad that I'm unable to use this footage. So we're starting here at the energy cell factory. Again, our most basic of all factories. It's not here to make money. It is simply here to make energy cells for the rest of our factories. So we've got our docking module, we've got our storage, a medium-sized storage container, and then we've got a connecting module, and then our 3 production modules. So now we'll move on to factory number 2, which is our space fuel factory. This is currently the most complex of our existing factories. And from a distance, you can see there are certain modules in this game that just really work for me. I really enjoy the look and the design of them, from whether it's the shape or the color palette, or really just whatever the case may be. But the space fuel production is one of those. I just really enjoy the look of these modules. And you can see we've got several of them on this particular factory. As we move over to the left-hand side of the factory, you can see our wheat production that is up and running, as well as down the center line here, we've got water production. So again, this factory has grown quite a bit over the course of this testing playthrough, and so far, so good. Next, we'll move on to our space weed factory, which is the 3rd factory of the 4 we currently have. And this is another one of those modules that I just really love. In this case, I really think the dome structure that it uses, along with the color palette, just do wonders for this. This is a great module and very easy to see from a distance, and very unmistakable if you're looking around. So it gives us the ability, quite a bit of room for expansion here, based on the fact that it's fairly simple to make. So we've got our swamp plant that is made down in the front here. We've got our spices over here, the nice cylindrical design to those. Nice color palette on the swamp plant, which goes into the production of our space weed. So again, just very cool designs that are here in the game, and one of the reasons why I really enjoy working with stations more so than I do simply just trying to build a huge fleet. There's just a lot of fun for me in building the stations and then in continuing to expand them over time. At some point, the money that they make just becomes almost an afterthought, as I find myself flying around from station to station, just enjoying the view. So here at our 4th and final station, our Majidust factory, we've got our tall tower-like structures, cylindrical type structures. That is the Maja snails. And then we have a little bit of water production here as well. We got our spices there that you'll probably recognize in the back. And then we've got multiple of the production modules for the Majidust. And this is, again, a great design. I love this design, and particularly the color palette. The glow that it gives off is really cool. And again, something that will capture my attention for quite a few minutes from time to time in the game, as I just fly around and enjoy the game for what it is. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned as we will continue our gameplay series of X4 Foundations.